This part of Solarpunk tech is in fact punk in terms of collaborative free DIY to the max. The great thing about computers and creating with computers is you just need the knowledge to code and create something without requiring any big upfront costs. For most of the 1970s, the majority of personal computers were run by hobbyists. An example of what hobbies can do as stated in the upcycling DIY video. One of the standard rules was that all code was free and was freely passed around, copied, and shared. If you needed an efficient and powerful computer, you could spend some free scheduled time on a government computer, which gave you the ability to get faster results instead of waiting minutes to hours to see if you screwed up the code. Steve Wozniak was probably one of the most famous people who was part of the software sharing community, and he and Steve Jobs worked at Atari and helped cut down the unneeded processors to make programs more efficient. These two were hardware builders, and built and founded the Apple Company and Apple II computers. If not for someone else, you probably wouldn't have paid much for the software, just the hardware. Bill Gates, however, changed all of this. While a decent programmer, his biggest innovation in computers was creating the intellectual property obsession and charging people for software, destroying the whole fair share ethos of early computers. After that point, investment money flowed in. When he designed DOS, he was angry that people in the free share community were passing around and sharing his intellectual property and not paying him for it. Never mind that most of it was programmed on taxpayer computers, and because of the sharing, his name was able to catch the ear of IBM, who hired him to code a specific version of it we know as MS-DOS, named after his new company Microsoft. Soon after, Columbia Data Products was able to completely reverse engineer the IBM BIOS in a completely legal way, and the first IBM-compatible personal computers came out, dropping the prices further for the average user. At that point, the charging for key operating software was born. Selling games such as Atari, and later the VisiCalc software that was the first spreadsheet program revolutionizing all of finance for the Apple, was not weird. However, Gates had an incredibly tight grip on not only his intellectual property as his divine right, but also seemed to take a manifest destiny belief in the fact that he had made Microsoft the monopoly on the market. You had to use Microsoft-compatible products, and if you dared to make anything cross-compatible between Windows and Mac, he had a whole group dedicated to changing the software just enough that the compatibility broke down. Since he had the money to do this, and people trying to make cross-compatible stuff did not, no one could keep up. Then he made his worst move. That was to not only create what is now viewed by US and European courts as a monopolistic move by packaging Internet Explorer with Windows, but this isn't the worst of it. He even used literal mob tactics to kill Netscape Navigator, the most popular web browser at the time. For the longest time, the media loved him and called him a kid genius and had an image built around him. But when required to testify to Congress about his unfair practices, he looked like a complete idiot when questioned, destroying his whole image. Prior to this hearing, he had zero interest in giving to charity and gave nothing, but did let his wife and mother give some he gave them because it was a silly thing important to them. You know, chicks, what you gonna do? Once he realized he could use charity to overhaul his image, while at the same time dodge taxes and gain political soft power with politicians, he jumped on the chance, and in one analysis, half his charities he funded either had nothing to do with actual charity, such as buying up vast swaths of farmland in Africa and donating to a bank, or cause more harm than good, such as being so obsessed with circumcision as a panacea to the AIDS crisis that the people receiving the treatment were led to believe they could no longer catch AIDS and ended up spreading it worse than if the charity hadn't existed in the first place. But because of this charity work, his image got reworked from being the most hated man in the software community to an elderly father figure doing work on the same level as Jimmy Carter, but with more money to fund it, like a tech Mr. Rogers passing on his great kind wisdom. This model would be expanded on by people like Mark Zuckerberg, who basically uses charities as a slush fund and a vehicle to gain more access to politicians. And behind the scenes, his fanatical obsession with intellectual property literally killed people and will kill more in the future, as Joe Biden wanted to build facilities in all nations to let them easily make their own mRNA vaccines as soon as the disease was discovered, and all they had to do was send the sequence and they could all start cranking out vaccines saving lives in their nations. But Bill lobbied the crap out of Congress, killing this life-saving deal. Intellectual property was so sacred, never mind that pure science to make it was mostly government taxpayer funded, and without taxpayer computers, he would have never been able to make MS-DOS. Copyright in software is one thing, and the people who code it should make money, but he exploited and abused labor, making him rich, meaning the coders never got fully paid for their work. He did. Steve Jobs went on to leave Apple, now pretty much collapsed, and it went through ups and downs after he left. He finally came back in the late 90s when they were at a stage where the technology was ready to innovate, still working on hardware with software as part of the background. With that, they invented the iPod, which transformed music overnight, but also unintentionally encouraged people to share music files with each other, as there was no longer any need to buy physical media. This broke the already exploitative, unsustainable music model with the appearance of a file-sharing program called Napster. This created a campaign against sharing or stealing music, as they call it, with slogans like, "You wouldn't download a car," and Lars Ulrich from Metallica being the face of the harmed artist. Never mind that with like Gates' DOS, people became aware of so much more music than ever before, which allowed some of the more underground to gain fame, which also hurt the music industry model. I feel like at this point, the only ethical way to listen to Metallica is pirated. Very metal. Finally, after enough lawsuits, Napster became a music selling company, along with Apple Store, and Napster replacement software such as BearShare, Kazaa, and LimeWire came up. This was later further replaced by torrents to get around the laws they broke, which is a software piracy you should never ever look into. In the face of rising subscription fees, deletion of TV shows from streaming services, and increased streaming inconvenience to the point that it's now as expensive as cable again if you want to watch everything you would usually just rent at a Blockbuster. In response to this, Gates created the Zune, which people had a good chuckle over and promptly forgot about. In the 2000s, Jobs also launched the first iPhone, putting the computer into your pocket. This changed our lives forever, connecting more and more people to the internet than ever before, as there was no longer a need to buy a computer to access it. And that was the last thing Apple innovated after Jobs died in 2011, other than the inability to replace your own battery and the removal of the headphone jack, so you were forced to buy overpriced earbuds, especially if you were part of the Apple cult, created to get as much money out of people not tech-savvy enough to know that they were getting ripped off. In response to the iPhone, Gates created the Windows Phone running on Windows 8, which people had a good chuckle over and promptly forgot about. After this, things on the software side were kind of going normally and gradually with business as usual until the subscription model replaced the software ownership model, often nuking software you bought in the past, breaking its ability to work, requiring constant yearly updates for software like Blu-ray, and ensuring that artists were stuck using constant rising costs of subscriptions of Adobe software they never wanted to use. Then machine learning took over, breaking everything. Before this, as Cory Doctorow put it, software coders were the gate between computer companies and unethical practices as they were in such high demand. AI suddenly made them ridiculously less valuable overnight, allowing one coder to do the work of many. Now coders have zero leverage to force companies to operate with any ethics at all. They are just scrambling to keep their jobs and roofs over their head, and shitification is ramping up exponentially each month. The customer is no longer right, just a cash cow to milk, and we saw all the big tech leaders cozy up and kiss Trump's ass the second he won, essentially promising him anything he wanted in a pay-to-play scam, be it in money or personal data for an ever-growing police state. Once called machine learning, now called the misnomer generative AI, every single big website and software and OS crammed their products with this invasive and data-grabbing AI no one wanted or asked for, and full of bloatware that drastically slows your computer, and it was at that point that I stopped using Windows. I refused to upgrade to Windows 11 and switched over to Linux. Unix was an OS created by Bell Labs to run corporate and industrial servers. This included ARPANET, the first internet, and was viewed as a universal OS that was much more malleable yet secure than any other OS on the market. Since much of it was or became open source, especially for government contracts, Linus Torvalds made a version of Unix more useful for desktop OS completely for free and called it Linux. This launched in 1991, and hobbyists donated their time and energy to tweaking it, adjusting it, and making it match the other OSs at the time, all in the original computer spirit of sharing. Mind you, these were all done in a somewhat disorganized fashion, however, they were able to scrape together an OS preferred by coders and IT folks, but pretty much ignored by the rest of the PC user market. Windows and iOS had a lot of growth they could continue to leap ahead of Linux on because they were multi-billion-dollar companies, and this was a ragtag team of people donating their time and energy into this OS, but never quite enough. Then Google decided to enter the phone market, and instead of going with an expensive OS, they used a Linux distro designed for smartphones they called Android. Android allowed you to do nearly anything to an unlocked phone and gave you complete freedom and control over your phone, which is why people who know how to use computers tend to prefer Android, because iPhones are designed to be very dummy-proof to the point that casual computer users can't do much of what they want with them. This increased funding for Linux, along with Oracle's Red Hat, which allowed Linux to get some much-needed catch-up for their casual user. With Ubuntu, which took Linux and made an OS the average person could mostly use in a limited framework, unlike, say, Arch, which requires a lot of technical know-how to run. At a certain point, OS improvement and innovation finally slowed down, to the point that in the 2020s, Linux is now nearly on par with the other OSs out there and keeps getting better all the time. There are tons of distros out there, other than for certain tools like Adobe for artists, and it doesn't look like they're ever going to make a Linux version. There is a free open source version of pretty much all software you can get on Linux. It's all free, no one is going to charge you for it, and it's not going to collect your data, and you can do pretty much everything you can on other computers. Gaming is an area where things are a little dicey, especially if you're trying to play some older games. However, places like Steam have a Windows emulator called Proton based on the emulator Wine that allows you to play most new games, but might still run into bumps. Software updates will occasionally break my ability to play Civilization 4, and I will have to go in and figure out how to fix things because I'm a weirdo and that's one of the few games that I play because it has mods. Otherwise, most of the newer games are designed with emulators in mind because they want to sell as many games as they can, and computer nerds, aka Linux users, are much more likely to be hardcore gamers, so ignoring that would lose them a market. Sadly, that can't be said for artists, so Adobe sees design with their emulators in mind as a waste of resources, and yeah, there are Adobe open source alternatives like GIMP and Inkscape, but it has a learning curve and can't create industry standard files that can be sent to the printers or easily shared in collabs, making Linux still not great for artists. The top-liked distros of Linux over the past few years are Arch, Fedora, Debian, and Mint. However, the first three are mostly used by hardcore users and not casual users, Arch especially. Mint appears to reign as king for beginners everywhere, including myself. Yearly tier lists have placed Mint at the top for several years, especially for newbies. One of the best things about Linux is that it can breathe life into old computers that are effectively dead using other OSs because they aren't clogged with bloatware or AI, and there are a lot less viruses out there that attack Linux as there are that attack Windows, and to a lesser extent Macs. 83% of all malware is made to attack Windows because of its ease of attack. Android is the top OS in the world and has 47% of the market share. Windows is at 26%. iOS is at 17%, macOS is at 5%, other Linux distros are at 1.4%. Android is Linux-based and macOS and iOS are Unix-based. However, one of the ever bigger reasons 83% of all viruses are designed for Windows is because so many offices use it as their OS, and it's much more profitable to attack offices and corporations than people. I have a 10-year-old laptop that, other than for high-end graphics, can do everything a modern Windows computer can do using Linux. Most people don't need the latest piece of tech, they just need the basics to connect them, and a local charity of mine I donated my old computer to is giving away free used computers if they run Linux because they don't have to pay for the OS, and they can use older tech to get the exact same results. Linux can prevent a lot of waste from going into the landfill. Linux is as solarpunk as you can get for all these reasons, and is just getting better every year, as less innovation is needed to make operating systems do what they do, and the gap between legacy and open source programs continue to shrink as most OS companies dump most of their investment into AI instead of new software because they mostly do everything we need them to do already. Even more so, Linux servers don't need added graphics cards at all, and can use old hardware to create cloud computing for low or no profit, cutting down on waste and saving toxic leaching materials from ending up in the landfill. This leads into the next section of free and open source Solarpunk social media, also referred to the fediverse, the most popular and well-known of course being Mastodon. And if you know anything about my other channel, I talk about this all the time, and now trying to figure out if I need to create a new script or if I can just reuse stuff from my other channel. Hey, reduce, reuse, and recycle. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. If you wish to be a part of this project, or want your Solarpunk art displayed discussing any of our main points of focus, please send everything to solarpunkusa@proton.me. There is also a Patreon link for my main channel if you like what I'm doing. For the first section involving community building, this channel will be run directly by myself. After that point, I hope to make this a collaborative project with many people involved, including voice, information, and editing to make this a robust channel that can spread and grow.